Hey, welcome to Victims and Villains, a podcast extension of the nonprofit that educates and engages individuals on mental health awareness and suicide prevention through pop culture. My name is Captain Nostalgia. Happy New Year. I'm going to be flying solo for this episode where I'm going to be talking to the writers and director behind the independent movie, The Great and Terrible Day of the Lord, which you can check out for yourself right now on any and all major digital platforms, including Vudu, Fandango, Amazon, and more. Before we jump into sitting down with those guys, though, I am going to share a little bit of my thoughts on this film as spoiler-free as possible and tell you guys why you should or should not check out this movie. Well, let's talk about the plot first. So the plot tells the story of a couple that just takes a weekend trip just to get away. And in that getaway, the boyfriend ends up succumb to either mental illness or being inhabited by God himself. I will be the first to tell you, as both a Christian and a cinephile, that I do not like Christian movies by any stretch of the imagination. I think that they are campy, cheesy, and I am just not the audience for it. I love and respect anyone that does identify themselves as an audience of those movies and loves them, but I honestly don't like. I just feel like it sugarcoats and kind of presents this very recycled version of the gospel in a very kind of campy way. The production values of those movies are usually pretty low. The acting is usually pretty terrible. The writing is really cringy. And while I will say that The Great and Terrible Day is not an outright Christian movie, it does dive in pretty deep to theological themes and reflections of the Bible, and particularly how Christianity as a whole and the deity between God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, kind of how they would in fact kind of interpret themselves and having a conversation with one of us. That said, honestly, one of my favorite things about this movie is the writing. I feel like this movie is very intelligent. It doesn't talk down to its audience, and it presents a cohesive story that is equally terrifying, but also at the same part, if we were faced with immortality and having to face our own death, it presents this very grounded response despite its very supernatural bent. Writer Jarrett Mason just crafts a story that is compelling, heartbreaking, thought-provoking, and just out at the end of the day, downright terrifying. I think a large portion of the themes and the dialogue that Mason presents to the audience is really going to turn some people off. This is a very dialogue-driven movie, so if you're a fan of like Quentin Tarantino and other more deeply profound dialogue writers and creators, I think this is a movie that will absolutely grip you, but again, this is not going to be for everyone. And also, I want to throw this out there, this is a movie that needs to be viewed with an open mind, because again, I think that there is an audience for a movie like The Great and Terrible Day of the Lord, but it needs to be presented in a open mindset, but also at the same time, also in that open mind, not only towards religion, but also towards a dialogue heavily driven film. That's the script that makes this movie such a gripping tale is its performances. This cast is really just made up of two people. It is Jordan Ashley Greer, who plays the girlfriend Gabby, and Suede McCoy, who plays Michael, the boyfriend, who also plays the God figure throughout the course of this movie. And the thing that is electric about the two of them is that they can play both lovers and essentially enemies throughout the course, and their performances are really good, but it is McCoy who just inches out Greer just by a little bit, stealing the show. His performance is commanding. It is just electrifying, and it is just exhilarating, to say the least. Like, I couldn't take my eyes off of him the entire time that I was watching this movie, and him just bringing this intensity to the character as the film developed, but also at the same time being able to be commanding but calm in the same time when he was channeling God. I just thought it was magic happening before my eyes. And so I really, really highly recommend this movie. Just again, I have to preface this is going to be a movie that you are either going to have to be a cinephile, you're going to have to like dialogue, and you have to be opened to the discussion of religion in film. So that said, I'm going to go ahead and give this movie, before we jump into the interview with these guys, I'm going to go ahead and give this movie a 4 out of 5. I really enjoyed this movie. The performances are commanding, the soundtrack is haunting, the cinematography is rich, and the dialogue and the script is just chef's kiss. It absolutely steals this and just makes this one of the best movies of 2021. And you guys can check it out now wherever you guys get your movies from digitally. Without further ado, I hope you guys enjoy our interview with the film's directors and writer, Jarrett Mason and Clark Runciman. Have a good one, guys, and we'll see you soon. If you or someone you know is listening to this podcast right now and you're struggling with suicide, addiction, self-harm, or depression, we encourage you guys to please reach out. This is the heartbeat of why we do what we do. Suicide is currently the 10th leading cause of death in the United States, and as of this recording, there are 132 suicides that take place each and every day on American soil. And when you scale back internationally, there are 800,000 successful suicides. That is one death roughly every 40 seconds. So if you or someone you know is struggling, you guys can go to victimsandvillains.net/hope. That resource is going to be right in the description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this. There you'll find resources that include the National Suicide Lifeline, which is 1-800-273-8255. You can also text HELP to 741-741. We also have a plethora of other resources, including churches, getting connected with counselors, LGBT resources like the Trevor Project, and also veteran hotline as well. Please, if you hear nothing else in the show, understand that you listening to this right now, have value and worth. We get it. Suicide, depression, mental health, these are hard topics, and the stigma around them doesn't make it any easier. But please consider the resources right in the descriptions below wherever you guys are listening, because once again, you have value and you have worth. So please stay with us.
Great. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, good to be here.
So this movie, I'm just gonna put it out there. This movie took me back by complete surprise. I really wasn't expecting the articulate conversations that the two characters have, and so just a quick synopsis, because I want to jump into the script and the screenwriting process first. So Clark, as one of the co-directors, can you kind of tell our audience what the actual like the plot of The Great Terrible Day of the Lord is all about?
Sure. A couple, Gabby and Michael, go away for their first romantic weekend together to an isolated cabin in the woods. Throughout the course of their first evening, Michael becomes possessed by a god persona, tells Gabby that she is going to die before the end of the weekend unless she repents and worships him. He then continues to flip back and forth between this god persona and his own, struggling with his own psyche, as Gabby tries to struggle with her own mortality and whether or not there is an actual religious event happening.
Like I said, this took me by such complete surprise, because I was kind of expecting this very intense psychological thriller, and while it is that to some extent, I feel like the script that you wrote, Jared, for this film is very articulately and very well spoken, to where
Thank you.
you have these characters that you're not really getting to see developed over the course of its runtime, but because of the dialogue, you feel like you're still watching them develop right before your eyes. I think Abigail's journey is just something of pure cinematic beauty, and I'm wondering if you can kind of talk about the idea of not only where the script came from, sorry, but also at the same time, kind of the challenges of writing these characters.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, part of it came from necessity because Clark and I were about as independent filmmakers can get. So our budget only allowed for us to be able to do so much. So we wanted to put something that had a lot of story in a little bit of space that would be more conceptual than require like visual effects or something like that. So part of it was coming from a place of how much can we do with a minimal cast, a very minimal cast, and very minimal locations, and that can be shot practically. And going into horror, just for me personally, like what scares me more than anything isn't like monsters and slashers, though I like those movies, but it's philosophical stuff. That feeling of not understanding what's going on. I don't know. A lot of people can relate to being in that part of your life where you're all of a sudden not sure how you see the world, and you're exploring different philosophies, or some people are exploring different religious points of views and stuff like that. And that's a scary process. That's a lot of like what being in that worst part of like an acid trip is like. And that's a lot of the feeling that I wanted to capture was an existential crisis, and try to portray that through something of a horror lens. It's kind of a horror mat on it more than it is a actual genuine horror film, but wanted to try and keep it as engaging as possible. There's a big risk of running into a lot of lulls and stuff when an entire 2-hour runtime is a conversation essentially between two characters. So it was a challenge to try and keep that in a way that still followed a genuine plot progression and story arc, and didn't devolve too heavily into like the mumblecore genre, where it's a snapshot of actual real life conversations that trying to keep it as driven and character and story and thematically focused as possible.
Now, I have so much more to ask about the script, but I don't want it to just be solely on the script, because this is a joint effort for both of you guys. And, like you said, Jarrett, like there's definitely this like when you're crafting stories on a DIY budget, it is very hard. And so the fact that you guys really were able to take this very common theme that I think there's because there's always that doubt, where do we go after this life ends? Do we get reincarnated? Do we go to heaven? Do we go to hell? Do we return to the ground? And this film tackles so much of that. And I really want to leave the plot as vague as possible, because there's so many twists and turns in here. But I'm wondering if you guys can kind of talk about the challenge of really casting both parts in here. So Jordan, Ashley Greer, and Suede, am I saying that right?
Suede, yep.
McCoy play Gabby and Michael are two central protagonists. And McCoy has such a presence about him, and I would imagine that it was a more difficult casting him than it was for Greer. But can you guys kind of talk about finding the perfect couple to really bring the story to life?
We could not have had two totally different casting processes for our two different actors. Suede we picked up first, and I'll let Jared handle that story.
Sure, yeah. No, believe it or not, Suede was the only person that, and this wasn't a friend of ours or anything. He was a stranger to us that we cast, but he was the only person that we considered or saw for the role. It was one of those, like, cheesy moments. You know, I was living in Hollywood at the time, and he was a Lyft driver of mine. And he was just very charismatic, and we got to talking on like a commute to work. And I mentioned that I was in the process of starting pre-production on a film, and that we were getting into casting. And he mentioned he was an actor, like all Lyft drivers in LA County are, and just asked for his consideration. We exchanged contact information and kept in touch. We looked at a couple of it. He was in a couple of things before he was in our movie, and he had a reel and stuff on YouTube that we looked at. And then I wanted to introduce him to Clark, so we took him out for a drink somewhere in North Hollywood, and we just sat and chatted for, I don't know, maybe 4 hours or something like that. We talked about talked about the themes of the movie. I can't remember if we had a finished script at this point yet or not, Clark.
I don't think so.
Shared with him, or we were just talking it through with him. But he was really excited, and we just were getting along on a personal level, and then on a creative vision for the movie as well. And just he totally got what we wanted to do with it. And we cast him without really seeing anything handle the performance. So it was at the time, and I'll let Clark talk more about how we cast Gabby, but it was at the time that we did callbacks in the audition process for Gabby that we actually truly auditioned Suede and made sure that he could act. We were doing it partially in truth and partially under the guise of a chemistry read with our considerations for the female lead. But we were watching him as well, and he ended up blowing us away like we hoped that he would. But yeah, we made a premature casting decision with him that ended up, I think, paying off.
Paying off quite well.
Yeah. Sorry, was I not emphatic enough about that? It was fantastic.
When we sat down with Suede, he just like understood everything that we were going for with the movie. And at the time, as Jared said, we didn't even really have a finished script. So we weren't necessarily sure what kind of scale this was going to be on. We were going to make it by hook or by crook, whether that meant we were going to shoot in one of our apartments. If, one of us had to be one of the roles, we were just going to, we barely had a few dimes to scrape together. So we were going to see what we could make work. Jared had that fantastic script, or bones of the script, to go on. So we were very, very excited to get it underway. Suede was at the beginning of that process before we knew too much about what we were doing. And every step of the way, we learned a little bit more. And it felt like it became a little bit more of a production, a little bit more buttoned up. There was definitely an aspect of flying by the seat of our pants. The whole way. But I think that's a great way to learn. And that's really what we wanted to do with this, was to get as much hands-on experience as we could and then have something to show for it. But our casting process, the next step up for us from hiring our Lyft driver, was to put out a casting call, and we had over 2,000 submissions for the role of Gabby. Jared and I took a lot of nights just going through reels. We held some auditions in person, and I think we had 30 ladies join us. And then had a couple callbacks. Eventually we had Suede read with them in person, and Jordan and Suede just had a chemistry that no one else there had, and we weren't even expecting ourselves. It was like they had already been friends, and they just clicked as a couple immediately. So that kind of solidified it for us for Jordan Greer.
You really get that within the first 10 minutes of this movie, where you're just kind of exploring the process of just seeing this vacation kind of unfold, and it paced itself so well that by the time you kind of get to the God switcheroo, that it feels like these characters really do envelop what you kind of think a romance should envelop. And I thank you guys for casting two great people to carry this movie, because a movie can have a great concept, but if it has terrible production or terrible acting, or the just the whatever functions as the bones of a film, if that's not there, the movie can somewhat be unwatchable. And I remember texting one of our writers, and I said, dude, like, I just got done this movie. It took me by total complete surprise. I really think it's a movie that you would really love. And part of that comes from the performances, the atmosphere, the isolation aspect. And so can you guys kind of talk to isolation is such a big part of this, where there's multiple scenes where there's no cell phone reception. They are quite literally in the middle of nowhere. There's one vehicle. And can you guys talk about the process for uh, location scouting?
Yeah. First, though, I just want to say that, like, to your point, we have to thank everybody else who collaborated with us more than just ourselves on elevating the project. Because I think if it was just up to me and Clark, we would have ended up shooting it on a $300 DSLR camera in a one-bedroom apartment, with one of us playing Michael. So it's the fact that we had two actors that they committed to 3 months, 4 months of a rehearsal process with us. We ran it like kind of a stage production in terms of like the rehearsal process. And, we brought on a lot of very talented people who knew more than we did about cinematography and lighting and sound mixing and stuff like that. So, they elevated it to what your point was, that, it was more than the script. We couldn't have done that ourselves. But yeah, Clark, do you want
to? Yeah, location scouting. We, it needed to be in a single location, mostly for budget purposes and for time constraints. We didn't really have the money to pay for a 1 month production. So we needed to do it in a place that could fit everybody. It had, needed multiple filming locations just for variety. And through Jared's family, we had a cabin that was available in Big Bear, California. They so graciously let us use it and, do our set design and everything, and wreak havoc, have 14 people stay within this cabin for 8 days. So we were extremely, extremely fortunate to have that opportunity for that filming location, because it was everything that the script needed, I think. It, allowed for different locations. We could carry a conversation through multiple rooms, just to make it feel more dynamic, so that, it gave it some personality as well. We didn't necessarily know what the setting character would be, like what the house's character would be, but I think it had a really strong presence in creating that mise-en-scène for the movie, and making them feel isolated, because there are a lot of vacation knickknacks up there that it's like it's good to get away from everyone. And I think there's one that says "Welcome to the Nut House." So it's just like some of these subconscious cues that we were able to place around the house, just to sort of focus on that isolation, even in kind of a kitschy way, where you show up to a cabin and you're not reading into all these things right away, but the more it closes in on you, the more you're looking at the things on the wall and realizing that they're mocking you for being there.
And I need to go back and rewatch it.
One of those necessity is the mother of invention sort of things, like looking around at what we actually had. Like I said, we were planning on shooting it in an apartment, but it was my wife who pointed out that her grandparents had a property they owned that was a rental property for them. And we came up with a little pitch, Clark and myself, to go to my wife's grandparents and basically beg them to donate the location to us, because we couldn't afford we were only there for what, Clark, 10 or 11 days in total, 8-day shoot. And we still couldn't have afforded to rent it for what they were charging at the time. So we're fortunate that we actually were able to have that connection. Because I know a lot of independent filmmakers don't have a space like that. But yeah, thankfully through my wife's family, we were able to find that. But otherwise, yeah, it still would have existed. It just would have taken place in a one bedroom in Hollywood, and the script would have had to reflect other reasons why she wasn't able somehow to get out of that situation. We would have found another way around that. So yeah, we redesigned aspects of the script. It was originally plotted before we knew where it was taking place to lean into what aspects of the production we ended up actually being able to secure.
I think the isolation really helps the story and kind of really bring forth a lot of that dread, because isolation is, we talk about mental health on here. Isolation and the feeling of being alone is truly terrifying, and it's kind of one of those things that, when you've gone through depression, that's definitely one of those things that you go through, and or that you feel. And I feel like for Jordan's character's arc throughout the course of this, being kind of revealed that basically God has inhabited her boyfriend Michael is, that's a terrifying thing. It's because, am I the only person who's ever experienced this? And there are points where the narrative does address that, and I really love that. But I'm so glad that you guys kind of brought up the fact that you shared that you guys almost kind of blocked this like a stage play, because it has a fluidity of a stage play. I think it's one of the things that makes it incredibly effective. And one of the things that I am going to make a pretty bold comparison here, in HBO's Watchmen, one of the characters is revealed to be Dr. Manhattan. He's been hiding in plain sight, but when you see the character of who he is prior to the reveal and who he is after, there's this complete shift in the way that the character interacts with everyone. And I think one of the great things that McCoy does really well in this is the fact that his body language completely shifts when he is these other personas, because there are some twists in the third act that I don't want to give away. But can you guys, what were some of the things that challenging to kind of really create visually a difference between him being Michael and him being this God persona?
I think that pass. Lost my train of thought. Terribly sorry.
No, that's okay. No, well, visually, we lit the characters differently depending on what persona Michael was in. And there was something different we did with the eye light and soft lighting and all that kind of stuff, depending on where he was in, to give like subtle differences. And yeah, we did give notes on things like body language for Suede when he was working, depending on what persona that he was in. And that was something that we really tried to tackle during the rehearsal process. Clark and I gave a lot of notes about the differences between Michael in the beginning, Michael as the Lord, and then Michael back after having experienced the break as being the Lord. And there was something that during the rehearsal process we got increasingly nervous about, because we tried a lot of different things, and there were points where we were like, try the Lord as Willy Wonka. Go watch tonight, watch Willy Wonka, and try and do something inspired by that performance, Willy Wonka. Like, just try to get new takes on it and see where we could find differences to play with. But that was something, that in the end, aside from how we were able to shoot it and the angles that we could take and the lighting that we could take, that Suede turned out on set. So we saw a lot of what he ended up doing with his performance for the first time as we were filming it, which is very, very exciting. We were blown away, especially compared to rehearsals. Not to say that, he wasn't turning out great performances in rehearsals, but just how committed he ended up being to different characters, or how much more natural he felt. Kind of something that he was always trying to do was kind of portray Michael as a little bit goofy and a little bit of like an awkward guy and all that kind of stuff, and then bring that aspect down after the Lord break. And so yeah, he really leaned into everything that we saw shadows of before then. So yeah, a lot of that is him and our cinematographer Tom Dowler helping us out with differences in how we framed shots and how we lit the shots.
Part of the rehearsal process that Jared touched on was that exaggerated approach. We were trying to stretch the characters apart as much as possible. And he mentioned the Willy Wonka note. We even brought in a cane for him to use as a prop during the rehearsal process, because when you're holding a cane, you have better posture. You feel a little bit more important, a little regal. So we included that, just little props like that to try and accentuate the things that you would do when you're feeling that way. But yeah, a lot of it was Suede genuinely being an incredible actor and finding a lot of those nuances through the rehearsal and during the shoot. Perhaps moments before a take, he would find those things.
And it's so seamless the way that it happens the first time, where I actually ended up like rewinding it to like, did I miss something? But there's such a seamless transition there between Michael and the Lord, where you are kind of just left in awe the way that, you kind of freaked out the way that Jordan's character is, where you're just like, oh, okay, I'm here for this. But like, speaking to her character as a whole, can you guys address or talk about what were some of the challenges of kind of developing a backstory for this character? Because it seems like we're kind of given a little bit of insight into her, but a lot of it kind of seems like some of the more developed aspects of her character kind of happened off screen between maybe you as directors and kind of Jordan as an actress.
I think that's all attributed to Jared's great writing. That we kind of begin this movie already in the middle of things. Their relationship is where it is. They're totally cut off from everything, totally isolated. So any external motivators are not necessarily going to change. She has these things that happened in the past, and we get to get that insight through their relationship interactions, which I think Jared did really, really well in the script, was to pull these, these deep down motivators from these characters, just by having them interact as if they were a couple on vacation. So we get a lot of exposition, I think, in a casual way that still maintains that feeling of natural dialogue.
And we don't want to shoehorn in too much exposition. They do have their deepest, darkest secret moment in the beginning before we get to all the Lord bits. But yeah, she was, she has that tragic story that happened with her mother and alcoholism running in her family. And, we always gave her a drink in her hand that she would take a drink whenever she felt like she was on, the back foot kind of thing. Whenever she was defensive, we were trying to portray her in like taking a drink and things like that. And what she's supposed to be a little bit is a stand-in for the human experience of going through something like this, whether or not you're going through a philosophical journey, or you're going through an existential crisis, or you're going through some sort of breakdown or whatever. The idea that, we're shaped by a lot of the trauma specifically that happens in our past, and how we've chosen to process that. And that informs how we're interacting and engaging with the present and the lens with which we view ideas that are presented to us. There's no such thing as a sterile or objective look. Hers that we gave to her was specifically her backstory with her mother's death, and how she may or may not be carrying that forward in herself. But there's only, the movie takes place over, about 30 hours, right? So there's only so much time where a couple talking and trying to fall in love, but being interrupted by what may or may not be a religious experience, or, a psychotic break. There's only so much time for significant character development in the way that I think you're describing. So we tried to do as much as we could without making it seem like we were taking little respite breaks for the audience's sake, not the sake of the characters.
So we're kind of running out of time here. So my last question that I'm going to have for you guys is, specifically to the script. And the reason why I wanted to ask this is because I am a man of God, and I think sometimes when you put God into media, it can really be kind of like a mockery, or can kind of like really downplay a lot of the stories that we read in the Bible. What I loved so much about the Great and Terrible Day of the Lord, and the reason why I feel like it really resonated with me, was not only because of all the mental health themes that are active in it, but this feels like a very articulate, and this is how I imagine a conversation with God would go. What was kind of the process like for crafting a lot of these monologues?
So yeah, to your point, it was important to me not to make a mockery of faith in any way, or to try and misrepresent the idea of faith, or what it is that people of faith believe. I didn't want to make it look, anything like intellectually inferior that it can sometimes be portrayed as, or talked about. I wanted it to be thoroughly researched, and I tried to make it. You take some liberties when you're telling a story like this one, but I wanted to try and make it theologically consistent and informed, and as accurate to. I studied a lot of what people say in like Christian apologetics and debates and stuff like that, and learned a lot of those arguments. And I wanted it to be sort of an airtight case that I want you to be able to poke through for holes in the persona of the Lord's logic, and have it be, at least within itself, consistent, coming from a rational place, depending on your presupposition, and presented articulately. Because the point of it necessarily wasn't those specific ideas, but how people are reacting and engaging with these ideas, and what our perceptions of these ideas are, and the phenomenon of whether or not you believe these ideas. So I didn't want this to become a platform for belittling them or misrepresenting them. I wanted to present them to the height of how I've seen them discussed theologically and intellectually and philosophically, and present it to the audience in a different context, in which I think, to me personally, it highlights that this is either a beautiful, wonderful thing that you're witnessing, or it is a horror movie, depending on whether or not it's real. And that is a lot of people's relationship to faith, or to being raised religious. A lot of people have resentment for it, or something like that, or a fear of organized religion, or they grow up in childhood with a fear of God or the devil or hell or something like that. So I wanted to be able to highlight both sides of it, that there are some people who look at faith and they see something totally rational and something totally beautiful, and there are other people who look at the exact same thing and see something that is abusive, or is a horror story. And we didn't want to make in the film a value judgment on which side of that Clark and I came down on, and the film did. We wanted to show Gabby's journey in dissecting that, and leave the audience and just exploring those perspectives, but in a context in which isn't associated with all the baggage that we're familiar with, culturally, in talking about faith, and a lot of the pitfalls those conversations usually run into, that I think miss the point of talking about these sort of things.
That's what, like I said, that's one of the things that I'm recommending people to go check this out. It is now streaming for rent wherever on any major digital platforms. You guys, the film is called The Great and Terrible Day of the Lord. Jarrett, Clark, thank you guys so much for talking about the film, the creative process, the casting process, and just everything. That has made this film. Make sure that you guys check it out. We'll provide links in the descriptions below. But thank you, guys.
Appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, and Happy New
Keep
Year.
up the good work with the podcast. Happy New Year.
Yeah, thanks.